Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Toward a Quality of Life. We're here with you again in the month of August, the year 2002, at the Roxbury studio of BNN TV. I'm flanked on my right by Dr. Paul Barrera, who's Chief of Community Clinical Services at McLean Hospital and the former Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Mental Health, as well as an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. To my left is Mr. Max Parker, who is a peer counselor at a program we're going to talk about tonight called Waverly Place at McLean Hospital, which is a program specifically for community-based services for people who have mental illness. And I think I'm probably partial, being a psychologist, to the problems of mental illness and having a sympathy or empathy for people with mental illness. But even apart from that, I think the problem of people with mental illness having a place to go and needing some way to be seen and integrated by all of us into a bigger whole is a need outstanding. So I'll begin by asking first by welcoming him to the program.
Thank you.
And
Happy
welcoming you, Mr. Parker.
Thank you.
I will ask you to sort of tell me what kind of need is there out there for mentally ill. I mean, are there a lot of people who are suffering a form of distress, even if they're coping with it, because they're kind of on the outside looking in?
Well, it's a significant problem. And it's a significant problem because a lot of the people who have the illness can't get access to services. If you saw the budget cuts that were just happening with the legislature, you realize that the Department of Mental Health had $13.8 million cut from its budget, its standard budget. And a lot of those services were residential programs, case management services, rehabilitation services, all aimed at helping people with this disability, the psychiatric illness that causes disability, to be able to make it in the community. So there's a problem there. And
who was funding? If you say the state has cut the budget, is that a Medicaid funding of these residences? What kind of funds are we talking about?
The funding for mental health services is complicated.
It's complicated.
Some of it comes from state tax dollars to the Department of Mental Health. Some of it comes from Medicaid, and some of that's matched by federal dollars. So you have money coming both from the state and from the federal government.
Hold on, before you talk, we do have to, that should be, maybe we're going to need something. We have...
I got it. That's good.
Thank you, sorry.
That's okay.
Yes.
So the money comes from all three sources. The money that comes from the Department of Mental Health for the citizens of the Commonwealth is focused on rehabilitation services, case management, and places to live. Those are the main sources of the money for DMH, plus the state hospitals, which are of huge importance to people who are chronically disabled and don't have a safe place to get their clinical care.
And there are very few state hospitals in Massachusetts, relatively.
There are fewer than there used to be.
Fewer than there used to be.
And more beds than in other states. It's a very complicated story about how many state hospital beds do you need for the population. And it's directly tied to how many resources you have in the community. So if you have more resources to provide care in the community, you have less need for beds in state hospitals. And the cost for providing care in the community in the long run is cheaper. But the transition from state hospitals to the community is always complicated. It's always costly, and people need to be supervised. They need care in the community.
So when the money was slashed, was it from all these sources that you mentioned?
The reduction in money for DMH was really targeted to a number of the services that DMH provides. So it didn't go just to one area. State hospital beds will be reduced. Some case management will be reduced. Some community programs will be reduced. Residential programs will not expand and may shrink.
So in your opinion, is this going to hurt? I mean, is it going to be a significant impact on people, a significant hurt to people that need to have the service?
I think it'll be significant. I think some people will be left out of services. I think it'll lead some people, you know, there are places where you see where the pressure goes. So when you restrict services, the bubble shows up in the homelessness shelters, people on the streets, people in jail, because they're not getting the services they need, and it sort of flows into those areas. In other states where there are even less services than we've enjoyed in Massachusetts, you see huge numbers of people with, honest to goodness, medical psychiatric illnesses who are showing up in jails and prisons.
Yes. Okay. Now, what are the major clinical problems in a lay term, in a lay language? The clinical kinds of problems a person who has serious mental illness, or an illness that's serious enough to be called mental illness in the psychiatric sense. What are those?
The simplest way to think about it is the organ in the body that's being impaired is the brain. So if you had trouble with your heart, you'd have chest pain, you'd have trouble breathing. If you had trouble with your lungs, you'd have a fever. When it affects the brain, it affects the things that the brain does for us. Thinking, having feelings, expressing ourselves. So what happens when you have a serious mental illness is it affects people's thinking. They have trouble thinking in an organized way. They have confused thinking. They develop bizarre perceptions, so they'll hear voices that aren't there. They'll think thoughts that have no basis in reality. And it affects their mood, so they don't have the normal reactions, the mood reactions to having friends, to being angry. So they'll have mood swings, they'll get depressed. And it affects people's planning, so they really can't plan their lives in the way that we are so accustomed to. So anything that we think of as the normal functioning of the brain can be impaired when someone has a major mental illness.
Oftentimes it even affects the body in as much as the postures and musculature itself is like
That's
evidence
right.
of illness.
And to the extent that what's happening in your posture is really from your brain, right?
Exactly.
It's like Parkinson's disease. It's a brain disease, but it affects the way people move. They get stiff. Well, the same thing can happen with mental illness. So people can develop some funny posturing, funny facial movements that are not related to drug effects. They are sometimes related to drug effects, but the direct result of a mental illness.
And sometimes the face wears too with the illness. Like if anyone ever read the book Zelda, Scott Fitzgerald's wife, how she changed undergoing mental illness. I'd like to talk to Mr. Parker right now, who's very nice to be here to talk about his situation, and I'll let him describe it himself, and maybe you can give us an example of your own life, of what it's like to have mental illness, which has been the case for you, and how it started and what it entailed.
Well, for a lot of people, it can come out of the blue, and for some people, of course, it starts early childhood. For me, I was an 18-year-old senior in high school, varsity athlete, popular kid, smart kid, and got a mental illness. I had a psychotic break, developed a mental illness with both depression, delusions, paranoia, and I was hospitalized for 7 months.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
Yes.
You do. Did any of them develop a mental illness?
No, I'm the only
Okay.
member of my family.
So how did you or other people know you had it at age 18?
Well, I was sad. I'd never been sad before. I've always been a real happy-go-lucky, healthy kid, and you know, I got depressed, and it was a warning sign for my friends and family. They didn't really know what to do. So I started seeing a psychologist.
What kind of symptoms were you showing that they know? Because teenagers are often sad, you know. But it must have been a little more extreme than that.
It was extreme because I was always a good student, and I began to lose interest in my courses, fail my classes. I was very depressed. I would go home after school and shut the shades and lie in the darkness and kind of lament and you know, feel bad.
And did people say, what's wrong? Did
Sure.
they come and ask you?
Oh, yes, everybody wanted to know. But because nobody could figure out, it became evident that perhaps a hospital situation may be good for me at the time, because I was not functioning very well. I was very just deeply depressed at the time.
Were you hearing voices?
No.
You weren't?
No. I was lucky
No.
that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Were you crying?
Oh yeah.
You were crying a
For
lot.
the first time in years, I started crying, and for me, some of the crying was a nice release. But since it's been so long since I cried, people saw, made my family, when they saw me cry, it made them, nervous or not really know what to do because it'd been a long time since I'd cried.
Mm-hmm. And there didn't seem to be any main event that could trigger you to feel this way.
It was a gradual. The depression came on gradually. The psychotic break was when my depression became a psychosis when I was hospitalized. I was in an unfamiliar situation, being hospitalized, and I was very fragile and depressed. And when I realized kind of that I was in a place and I was scared to be in that place, I kind of snapped and developed, went into kind of a psychosis where I was, very paranoid. I couldn't sleep. I didn't think very rationally. My mind was racing and just unable to reason.
Was that an unpleasant experience for you, or just one you went through one way or another?
I wouldn't say it was a good experience being hospitalized. It was quite frightening. But I was in a good hospital with good doctors, and I was there for a while, about 7 months. But about 6 months into the hospitalization, I wasn't getting much better, and they tried various medications on me to see if they would stabilize me and allow me to sleep again and to slow my mind down and get me functioning. So they tried a drug called Clozaril, and it worked miraculously for me. It stabilized me. I started to become sleep better and think more rationally and talk again and recognize my parents when they came to see me. And that was a major step in my illness, getting a medication that worked for me.
Do you feel that you're living a complete life now?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. I mean, the medication takes certain things away because of the side effects. It's difficult to work full time. School. I did graduate from
How
college.
do the side effects affect you not being able to work full time?
Well, it's the medication I take causes pretty strong sedation, especially in the mornings. It makes getting up for work. It's already hard for me to get. It was already hard. It's always been hard for me to get up in the morning, but it makes it kind of a monumental task sometimes, and it's tough to get started sometimes. The day started. It was also difficult in college because inevitably in college you have morning classes, and it's kind of hard to focus on those courses. So it took me quite a while to get my degree. So.
Okay, so you do peer counseling at Waverly Place, which is what kind of a place?
It's a new program that Dr. Barrera helped create or created. We are sort of a reintegration program. We help people who have had a history of illness reintegrate into the community. We help them with their daily living skills and as well as getting jobs and volunteer work. And,
what's a daily living skill that people would have to be helped with?
Well, some people who are ill, their houses can fall into disarray and they need some help organizing their home. Sometimes an individual may need help at the grocery store to stay on budget, and people have anxiety, and so it helps to have some company and to go to the grocery store and help people do their shopping.
How severely organized or unorganized, how severely not managed, not self-managed are the people that come to your program?
It varies. I mean, some people need help with their activities of daily living, and some people are in a situation where they're ready to work, be it volunteering or part-time pay or full-time pay. So there are different.
Different levels of how much assistance people need.
Yes. Yeah.
Now you were talking, Dr. Barrera, about people needing to learn survival skills. How would you define or describe those?
I think Max is doing a good job. The thing that's important to remember is that activities that we take for granted, being able to balance a checkbook, being able to plan our day, being able to take a budget and figure out how much money for food and how much for rent and so forth, can be very complicated for for people for whom the brain is not working normally. And then there's the other phenomenon that people who have had the kind of serious illness that Max is talking about, they kind of drop out of society for a while. So their cohort group goes on to work and have families, and they're left behind, and they get socially isolated and feel very uncomfortable in social situations. And that adds to a sense of incompetence. So what we try to do is help people with very basic skills. If they don't know how to get their SSI, SSDI, they don't know how to balance their budget for the month, we'll help with that. If they have trouble organizing, as Max was saying, just organizing their day and their week, we'll do that.
Yeah.
There are some people for whom just coming to Waverly Place and being with other people is a huge step in their recovery. And they'll tell us, if I'm not here, I'd be in my apartment alone, watching a TV and doing nothing else, or sleeping, just doing nothing. So the very act of getting out and being around a social situation is already the first step to their recovery. And there are others, they just haven't had a work history. And the important thing to think about with work is we all take it for granted. You know, if I didn't have work, I would be a very sick person. I'd at least be depressed. Work has its own beneficial effect for all of us. It enhances our self-esteem. It makes us feel confident. It makes us feel like we're contributing to society. So to get these folks back to work is a huge step in their own recovery. It gives them a sense of being worthwhile individuals. It gives them a purpose in their life. It makes them feel like they're competent in ways that they haven't felt before.
This would probably be a subset of people that are that is motivated in a way.
We're actually organized so that people who are not motivated can just show up and we'll start helping them.
Yeah.
Or they can say, we have somebody who, for a while, couldn't get out of their apartment. They just couldn't go places. They wanted help, so we went to them and then started helping them get out. So we'll take anybody at any level of motivation, as long as they're willing to take the first step.
But there may be some people out there who are not willing, right?
And there are some who are not willing.
They're not willing.
Right.
Do they fall into any kind of category as being more ill, or?
You know, I think it has to, one of the things we didn't mention when we talked about the symptoms, particularly with psychotic illnesses, is that it leaves people with a certain unawareness that they're ill. It's a very hard thing for the general public to understand, but the illness itself will cause people not to recognize that they're ill. And so they don't even think that they need help. And they won't ask for help and they won't receive help. They either believe their delusions, they either believe that their voices are real, and they just don't see themselves as impaired. And it can be a terrible burden to the family.
Don't you think no matter how ill someone may be, how psychotic or delusional, that most by far have also a certain sense, a third sense if you will, that they're not running with the rest of the herd, that they are on the outside? A slight inkling that they're unconventional, so to speak?
Some do, but I've heard some wonderful stories about why they're in the life that they're in. That is it's just an incredibly creative rationalization for why they're not working, why they never finish school, why they don't have a girlfriend, why they're living on the street, why they have no clothes. And you know, you say, I think you're ill. You come from a family that wanted you to do something and you're not doing anything, and they'll have just the whole story that they believe. And it explains away entirely the way they're living their life.
Tell us a little bit about psychosis more specifically, because people don't know what psychosis is.
So it's a little complicated to describe. You know, here's something I would suggest for your viewers. If people haven't seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, it is a wonderful way to try to get a sense of the experience of someone who's psychotic. And the reason it's important is that the person's life feels entirely real to them, even though it may seem entirely irrational to us. So if someone, for instance, is hearing voices, supposedly, the auditory hallucinations, they believe the voices, they hear the voices.
What do those voices often say, for example?
And they can say anything from complimentary you're doing wonderful, you're a terrific person, you're the leader of the world, you're Jesus Christ, to you're a terrible person, you deserve to die, you should go throw yourself off a bridge, to there's a conspiracy against you and you've got to watch out for these people because they're really out to take you and poison you and get rid of your life. So the voices, they can be men's voices, they can be women's voices, they can have long dialogues, or they can be repetitive statements. The important thing is that the individual's experience is it's as real as you hearing my voice. It's not make-believe.
Right.
Similarly, when they have these funny thoughts that are irrational, the lights are sending messages to me, people are speaking in my ear, somebody can take the thoughts out of my head. These are real events. It feels entirely real to these people, and so they act on it as if it's real. And what happens when you see them in the street, for example, is that to a lot of people in the general public, they look and say, that person is just acting bizarre, or they're talking to themselves, or they're making weird statements. And it does feel strange and weird to us as an outsider. To the person, it feels real.
And do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, he's fairly accurate.
And
I haven't heard voices, but...
You've heard voices?
No, I haven't heard it, but... Yeah.
Can you describe some of what your inner experience was?
Yes, paranoia.
What
you know, I had this irrational idea that one of my relatives was being raised to take over our family or something, which was completely not grounded. And there's also the delusions. He mentioned that sometimes voices tell people they're something they're not, and I had some of those delusions where I thought I was another sort of a messianic complex where you think you're the Lord, or you know, I had some of those in my sickness, which is quite common. People, you think you're something you're not, and you know, you sometimes when you're psychotic and you get paranoid, you feel people out to persecute you, and that, you know, when you're sick, you can rationalize your delusion, like Dr. Barrera said here, and you think that it's real, you know, and you believe what these delusions lead you to believe. It can become quite confusing and somewhat frightening.
So you can be frightened in your delusional state.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fair thing to say. Yeah, that a manic condition is a frightening condition.
It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
When you're, if you're, some people who are mentally ill get manic, and that's when it's very easy to get out of control in your life and do irrational things, like allowing somebody off the street you don't know to come stay in your home, you know, just because you feel so good to do it, and you feel great and you're inspired, and you don't realize that you're really, you know, you're sick. You have no tether to hold you down anymore, and eventually, what happens is you crash, and it's hard when you're manic, particularly hard because it feels, when you're hypomanic, like that means very manic, it feels pretty good. It feels like you're inspired, you can take on the world, and you believe it. And
when you're not too overblown, just enough to make it good, when you say hypomanic.
Yeah, well, it's just a high level of mania.
When you're when you're literally manic.
Yeah, yeah. It's because when you're depressed, you know you're depressed. You feel terrible. You don't want to feel that way. When you're manic, you want to go with it.
The world is your oyster.
It really is. It really can feel like that. That was my experience, and my peers, as well.
That person, Concannon, was one of the most classic cases of high mania, of an adventuristic kind that you can't even fathom.
That's right.
Even by regular standards.
That's right.
Oh, was that something? And no one could appreciate that really unless you've tried to get into the psyche of a lot of people that are manic. He lived on a level of adventure that was so unrealistic, if people remember the person who ended up murdering Versace, the designer, in Miami. He lived on such an unrealistic level of reality.
I heard a story of an aerospace engineer, physicist, who became manic and started. He had these great ideas to advance aerospace engineering, and he would put these ideas forth. At the same time, he was building homes and purchasing other homes and spending his money buying cars. And you know, he got so put his energy in so many different areas, so it's such a manic nature, that it all folded on him and it collapsed. Even this guy's a genius too. So it's tough. It can happen, you know. And it's good if it's fortunate if you get in that state, you have people around who care about you, to say, listen, you need. And one thing I've learned from my experience is, if anything, the main thing is that if I need help, I'll ask for it, because a lot of people, at the time in their lives when they need the most help, are least likely to ask for it, and it's nice to have a support group of friends and family who can also see that. That's unfortunately, homeless people don't, or some of the people who get sick or homeless and don't have families, don't have that support. They don't have the resources even to...
I also think families, not to blame them, tend to shy away from people in those conditions, a certain element. You know, it's scary.
Yes.
And I just want to get back to what you said, that if you're in a state like this, you very well are likely not aware, because you're in it. That's the state you are. You're not in. You're not in looking at that state. You are in that state.
Exactly.
So you're not aware. Should people be scared of people in mentally? Now we're just looking at the manic condition. Some manic conditions can be very deceiving to the general public. Even they can just be really high people, maybe, you know, for a moment, But you know, then there are the cases of people hearing voices, and in not so manic a condition at all, just purely psychotic, so to speak, and you know, talking to themselves or screaming or saying things that are not coherent and not manic necessarily, just not coherent.
Right.
Is there something that's fearsome too? Did you find that people?
I think we've all seen people on the streets at one time or another talking to themselves or preoccupied in their illness, and I don't know if I feel scared. It's more like I hope that somehow they get some.
Well, you
help.
don't feel scared.
Right.
Were
But
people ever scared of you?
Probably.
You didn't notice it.
But I wouldn't have. Yeah.
You wouldn't notice it.
I wasn't, you know, violent or anything like that. But you know.
Should we be scared?
Well, you know, I think it's a complicated story, because the press tends to sensationalize terrible events, murders and stuff, and people who have an illness. And it tends to portray the idea that most people who have mental illness can be violent. And I think when people look at the literature, it's a minority of people with mental illness that are committing violent crimes. And even in that case, many of those are committing crimes because they not only have a mental illness untreated, but they're also using substances, alcohol or other substances, and that fuels the violence. So there's that part of it. I think it gets overplayed in the press. It is still true that some people can get very paranoid and be very frightened of the world, and if they're confronted in a certain way, challenged, they may react violently, or they may react to the challenge in an aggressive way. So that's also a problem.
What would be a real practical example of someone being paranoid in real terms?
People say you're in the grocery store, you think people are talking about you behind your back, you think people are plotting against you, conspiring against you.
And so what do? You get out of there, or you... Or do some people feel like doing something violent?
No, I don't think so. I think
they
they
want to escape the circumstance.
Yes, that's the way to put it, yeah.
And it can become generalized that you think everybody's against you. There is, you can't trust.
I think if you get further into it, yes, you think that the whole world's against you.
Exactly.
And that you know the truth and nobody else does. It's a tough situation then.
The other thing I want to come back to about the people feeling frightened, some of it is we're just not used to seeing that behavior. It's foreign behavior, so it scares us. The problem we have, the public has, is that it's hard to see that there's a real person behind that odd behavior. So you tend to stereotype them. You know, it's a stranger, they're acting odd, they're talking to themselves, they're saying odd things. But what's hard for us to do is to say, okay, this is a real person, they have a name, they have a family, they have a history.
Experience.
And they have experiences that we can identify with. And that tends to get lost.
That's why one reason I like my job, because if I hadn't been through the experiences with my psychosis that I've been through in the last, the symptoms were bad for about 4 years, it'd be a lot harder. It's already hard, but it'd be very, very difficult to work, because when somebody's in a distressed state, very sick, and you have to maintain and how do I put it, counsel the person. It can be difficult, but my own experience has strengthened me. And I've seen most of what these people have experienced, some, and seen most of what they're going through and they've gone through. So having that experience, it gives me the strength to work with people with mentally ill who are very ill.
Sort of like seeing that you're not alone.
I do like that's good because you're with people who can empathize with you. It's great. I mean, sympathy is great. Caring about people when you're not mentally ill, it's wonderful. Sometimes they're more comforted. They feel more comfortable talking to somebody who they know who's kind of experiencing what they're experiencing. Who can empathize with them, like I said, and just.
Don't you think, Max, that it's easier for you and your group of peer counselors to communicate to the members at Waverly Place that you appreciate? They just want what everyone else wants.
Yeah.
They want friendships. They want to feel productive.
They want to be treated with dignity.
And they want to be treated with dignity.
That's a
it's
key.
a sort of common human wants.
I was helping a lady balance her checkbook, and we were talking while we were doing it, and she said to me, she says, I like talking to you, Max. I said, why? Because you hear me. and she has her whole treatment team, and so it moved me that she said that. So.
In the vernacular, being the half full, half empty person I am, it ain't going to happen. Let's talk about that. We barely have time to stop for people who act like us. We require,
sure.
you have to take a lot more social grace extension out to understand if you're walking in the shoes of someone that doesn't understand this experience. You have to sort of bend over backwards from your frame of mind to be empathetic, or to give the time of day, so to speak, to someone.
Right. I mean, that's what I feel like I'm kind of doing though. There.
But I'm saying the person who hasn't been in the grips of mental illness,
right?
Because as a society, we basically don't have time for each other. Period.
Sure.
And it would take a little more effort, shall we say, or understanding, to be in interaction, or at least in consideration of someone who's in the grips of a.
I think that's why it's important we just raise the awareness. What's going on out there with mental ill. Remove the fears and the stigma.
Well, how do we know to not be afraid? Should we just be boldly unafraid, or if we see people acting out, so to speak, on the street?
I mean, if somebody's acting on the street, you don't have to go up and, there's other people out there who that aren't mentally ill who can be dangerous too. And I don't. I guess I don't think there's reason to be terrified of them.
Well, for example, that residents in communities where mentally ill persons are being placed to live also have challenged and continue to challenge that mentally ill people be allowed to live in their midst.
This is the problem of
it's a tough
not in my backyard, so I don't want, we have a two-family house that's connected to Waverly Place. It's in the neighborhood, and we're using it for members of Waverly Place so that they can have a kind of normalizing environment. There's the typical two-family up and downstairs house, 2 bedrooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms downstairs, and we're putting members in there, each having their own bedroom, and they're living independently. We don't staff it. But when you try to do that in any public way, you get the neighbors this happens with Department of Health a lot. You get the neighbors reacting, saying, these are dangerous people, they're going to have a bad effect on their family and kids, I don't want them here. Most of the time, and I'd venture to say 99% of the time, once that home is accepted as a residence for people with mental illness, there are few problems with the neighbors. Once they can overcome their biases and their fears, they actually become good neighbors.
And I tend to think that we fear it we don't understand. And that's why I think education is always really important, promoting awareness of mental illness. I don't think it's something to be terrified or afraid of.
So then what you're saying sort of is that people have to pitch in and try to help their neighbors by just being more tolerant.
More tolerant, and don't prejudge and learn about it. I mean, a person with mental illness like Dr. Barrera said, has had their own life experiences, their own family, their own history, their own loves and losses, and just like everybody else, they just have a chemical imbalance in their brain that makes it a little harder for them, sometimes a lot harder for them to function in a society that stigmatizes them an awful lot. But for me, it's been encouraging because I've seen in 10 years a lot of development in this awareness, understanding that it's a biological disorder and that the insurance companies should cover us. That's a whole other.
Well, I'm going to take the liberty to put my point of view here about biological disorders. I think that everything we are is biological. You know, normal, abnormal, mentally ill, conventional. It's all biological, and I'm still a believer in so much of what your life is and who you are goes into illness. I mean, I don't like just the chemical imbalance description of mental illness. You know, it's a part and parcel of a total human being, and you know, anything we do, be it regular or irregular, so to speak, is correlated with brain function. So that's how I feel about it. And I was thinking about, does medication help everybody?
You need to talk about which diseases are being medicated.
I see.
And at what point in the disease is the medication working. So the best data exists for people with manic depressive illness. It's probably the best model for biological illness. That these mood swings from mania to depression are hard to characterize as something that's due only to psychology or only to environmental situations. And when you look at manic depressive illness and you look at the use of lithium or other agents for the treatment of mood disorders, it's extremely effective. 80–85% of people will have an improvement. Both in mania and depression, the cycles won't be so deep, they won't be so frequent, and it works extraordinarily well. When you get into some of the other illnesses, like schizophrenia, the response rate is not as great. When you move into anxiety disorders, phobias, and depression, the treatment response is terrific. It's, you know, you're at 75–80% or better if you make the right diagnosis and you're using it for acute symptoms. The interesting thing in this regard is that the general public has a feeling that doctors who treat asthma, high blood pressure, diabetes, colitis, and arthritis do a better job of treating those illnesses than we do in treating manic depressive illness and schizophrenia. But the fact is, our response rate is as good or better in treating manic depressive illness, depression, anxiety, than treating high blood pressure, asthma, arthritis, diabetes. So we have effective treatments. We have effective treatments if we can make the right diagnosis. And then it fades because, you know, as you were suggesting, we have a history, we have a psychology, as well as having our physiology. And as you move into less serious depressions, anxiety, then it becomes a mixture of psychology, environment, how we see ourselves, as well as physiology.
Yeah. I even think psychology is physiology and physiology is psychology. It's just that we could never in practice pin down every physiological element that corresponds and vice versa. But we certainly, if we're very good observers of people and we truly get inside of them, which we don't have time to do today, we can definitely get a grip on, you know, on what people are about and what a person is about. And that's somewhat a lost opportunity today, you know, given the state of how we manage our.
And there are many consumers, so-called consumers, people who have had serious mental illnesses and some point of recovery, who would argue the most important treatment, even for psychoses, is connectedness to people, real relationships that help them understand themselves, don't get scared by the psychotic symptoms, and help them kind of reintegrate. So there's a whole other area that talks about the need for human connectedness as being a way of, as being therapeutic and helping people to recover.
Absolutely, and we go back to some of the most fundamental principles, such as trust. A person we all don't trust each other, but a person in the grips of a severe episode likely, you know, hasn't got the capacity to trust. It's so far gone. And these are existentially very empty, outer space kind of places to be. Sometimes when you get into the mind of people that are severely ill, you become overwhelmed and just pressed upon by how distant and alien they are walking among us as human beings.
And the ability to see through that, to touch the individual, is very powerful. So a lot of what helps people restore a sense of being human again is having relationships where they can see past the symptoms, they can see past that sort of foreignness, and find the human being who's still there, dealing with this.
And that's what I wanted to mention too, regarding symptoms. Like in a lot of instances, medication certainly affects symptoms, but does it affect truly? Does it bring a person back to, if a person was in a relatively wholesome condition, does it bring a person back to a viable, flexible, resilient, easy to roll, ability to handle a lot of stress and run with the pack? Does it bring a person necessarily back to that level of function?
In many, many, many instances, it does or can. I mean, that's essentially what Max is describing. 18 years old is a very young age. I mean, you're still a kid. You're still trying to become an adult and a person. So to get ill at 18 and be out of commission for 3 or 4 years is a major assault on someone's development. Just think about it. I mean, relationships, learning to work, studying, whatever the person was hoping to do between 18 and 22 is just thrown right off the road. So you get something like a medication that works, and the person kind of feels restored again. It's what you were describing.
I was one of the lucky ones. The medication worked me and continues to work. I've taken it for 11 years. But you know, it's also important to have, it's beneficial and important to have a support structure, friends and family. But you also have to you can take your meds, you can go to your doctors, you can talk to your family, but you have to do the hard stuff for yourself sometimes. Look inside yourself and see what you need to improve. You can't, there's no magic pill out there yet. Hopefully one day maybe there will be. I doubt it, but you know, you have to do the hard, I call it the hard stuff, because you know, taking a pill isn't very hard. You know, but really working, you know, you have to take a risk. I was terrified of hospitals, and from my experience, and I took a risk when I heard about McLean to go to McLean, and then you know, McLean, I learned about Waverly program, and then I was nervous about that, but I wrote up a resume for Dr. Barrera to go to Waverly, and all these were risks, and I doubted myself a little bit because, you know, I've been ill in the past and had a gap in my resume, and I took those risks, and that was really hard, you know, and I'm just saying that sometimes you got to just really...
I didn't want to sound soupy when I introduced you, but I was going to use the word courage. I didn't want to sound soupy, though. But I think you hit the nail on the head. It takes courage. That's the existential, but that's a reality, too. That's the existential truth. It takes courage. I mean, I myself have struggled with anxiety in my life, severely so. And you really do have to participate and handle it yourself ultimately, really.
And if I can play on this a little bit, again, for your viewing public, it is so easy for everybody on the street to see somebody in a wheelchair, or somebody who has cerebral palsy, or somebody who's dealing with some physical disability, and say, boy, aren't they courageous? Look what they're willing to do. They get out there to work, they've got a stroller, they've done something, they overcome the physical disability. And in general, people fail to see the courage it takes to live with a serious mental illness.
The courage it takes to live.
That's right. I mean, it's not easy, because the medications don't always take away all the symptoms. It's not easy to get up every day and to hear voices and say, I'm going to ignore those voices, and I'm going to send myself to work, and I'm going to have friends. It's not easy to be depressed or to feel that you're worthless or to have these funny thoughts and say, look, I can live my life even with these things in my life, because I can find islands of sanity I can find
I like
people I can connect with,
yeah.
and I can do alike.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, I think it's because it's not physical, it's not public. And we're just so used to identifying people who overcome physical disabilities. Think about the Olympics, the Special Olympics. But there's nothing comparable yet to help the general public appreciate that people like Max and a lot of other people have just as much courage in living their lives every day.
Well, you know how we want people to dress like us and walk like us, too. I mean, what if people look weird to us, so to speak? What if they wear funny kerchiefs on their head or, you know, shouldn't we make fun of that or steer clear of them because they look so odd to us? I think
that's part of what happens.
That's part of what
Does
happens.
happen.
And also,
unfortunately, yeah, it does happen.
Spiritually, even mental illness notwithstanding, we're not prone. There's a certain element of us that likes psychology, and there's a certain element that uses it and sort of believes in it. Even it's become somewhat bastardized in a way. But generally speaking, we're not prone to examine ourselves. That still remains for a very small percentage of people. We're not prone to go that direction about human nature. We'd rather, the grand denial, we'd rather not know what all that stuff is about.
The unexamined life is not worth living.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly. The unexamined life is not worth living. So do you have some parting words for people regarding community psychiatry and people with mental illness being in the community?
You know, go for it. Find you know, have the courage to, you know, live your dreams,
and it's going to be tough.
And it's tough.
And
it's
you
not
suffer.
Easy.
You can't say you don't.
And you suffer.
And that's the way it is, though. You just have to make the best of it and do the best you can.
Try to overcome your fears and take some risks and be strong. And, you know, don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it, and don't be afraid to trust a person or two if you need to, you know, to reach out.
So you don't follow the trust but verify school of thought, huh? You could do that too. You can trust and verify. You can see how people are to you, and you can, you know, sort of just put your toes in the water and take it step by step. And
day by day.
What would you say, Dr. Barrera?
I think that you always try to let the people like Max speak for themselves and have the last word, because they know better than we do what it's like to live with the illness. We usually have a lot more insight into it than we do.
Okay, and so people, please be aware that there is a Waverly Place at McLean Hospital. I know you don't have all the resources in the world, but at least some people will be able to benefit by that. And what they're doing over there is helping people with all the practical concerns that they might have and not be able to do because of the mental illness that they have suffered or continue to suffer. So I guess that's about it for this evening, and I appreciate so much that you would come here and talk to us this way.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And
We're
good night.
happy to do it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good night, and we'll see you again.